Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Record Live. And welcome, Jared.
Thank you, Zanita. You're back from
I'm back.
Tasmania.
Yeah, I feel I've taken a week leave, and the last thing I did before I left was Record Live last week. So I feel like nothing's happened. I've just jumped back on. Here you are again.
Here we are again. But everyone else has been waiting all week to see us again. So
it's exciting to be back. I'm excited about today's conversation. We don't have a special guest, but we have a special topic, which is the topic of generational Adventism or generational faith, we could kind of just call it. And I just think this is just interesting. I'm a generational Adventist. I think you are too, Jared. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think it'll be a good conversation. If anyone is watching, we'd love to hear what your experiences have been like. So if you are a generational believer or if you aren't, it would be cool to hear just what your experience has been like, because it differs from person to person. But I think for starters, the reason we are talking about this is because one of our staff members, Olivia Fairfax, has written about this in the next issue of the Record. And she has titled her piece, "Do You Suffer from Generational Adventism?" And so for starters, what I thought would be cool is maybe, Jared, if you could share a little bit about what your experience has been like as a generational person of faith, and how you've kind of navigated that.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. It is an interesting topic, and I think it's one that it's important to think about, to look at from time to time, because it impacts our kids if we have them, or when we have them, if we haven't thought about it, intentionally passing on our faith. And to some extent, if we are a new Christian and we're just coming into the church, just meeting Jesus as adults or for the first time, that's going to impact us. If we're coming in as a second, third, fourth, fifth generation, Christian, that's going to impact us. So I think it's important to understand how our faith journey is impacted in that way. So for me, I guess I guess we can get into more specifics later if necessary, but just as a sort of summary, I think my great-grandparents on one side and probably my grandparents on the other side came into the church, into the Adventist faith. They may have been some kind of Christian, I believe, before that, but this was the time that they started committing to the Adventist church, at least. And that was a very strong commitment. Like, my grandfather was a missionary, and did work overseas for the church in Fiji and in Papua New Guinea and Lord Howe Island and places like that. And my other grandfather worked pretty much his whole life for the Sanitarium Health Food Company. So he was in the health side, sort of health food side of things with church work. So I guess it meant something to them to the point where they expended a lot of their professional lives, their careers, and their energies on that. My grandfather was a very good my maternal grandfather, my mum's dad, was a very good dairy farmer, dairy tester. He used to go around testing cattle in northern Victoria and stuff, and he was very good at that job. He was only 18, 19 when he was starting to do that. But when he was a young married man and sort of just starting to have his family, he became an Adventist. And so that changed his whole life trajectory. Instead of going into farming and that sort of thing, he went and did teaching and theology and stuff like that. So yeah, that changes the whole family dynamic in some ways. You are born where you're born to a great extent because of the faith of your parents and your grandparents. And I've always been grateful for that. But I guess and it helps if they're intentional in passing that on. But you can't just get into heaven, I guess, on the strength of your parents or your grandparents' faith necessarily. There's some commitment or some journey that you have to go on as an individual. And there are dangers with being a second, third, fourth generation Adventist where you don't have the same passion or the same commitment necessarily. And I'm not saying that judgmentally, but I'm just saying each generation has to make the decision for themselves. There's only first generation Christians. Everyone needs to make that decision for themselves. So I guess there are pros and cons. Looking at my life journey, I'm very grateful and very glad that I was brought up the way I was. But at the same time, it's not a given. It's not a given that I'll all of a sudden, take on my parents' faith. And so there's stuff to explore there. But before we get into some of the specifics, what about yourself? Give us a bit of because I don't want to talk
bit of my life
your journey.
So I'm trying to think, actually, on my dad's side, I don't actually know how many generations it goes back. It at least goes to my grandparents. And not only am I a generational Adventist, but my grandpa also worked for Signs of the Times. So I guess I'm a generational Signs of the Times worker too. But
that's very cool.
Which is funny. But yeah, on my mum's side, my nana and my grandpa, they weren't Adventist. My nana actually got really sick and was taken to the Sand Hospital, and that's where she was converted, and that's where she found God. But she had already had kids by that stage and already had a partner who didn't have a faith, and so that was not your classic journey. But so I guess I definitely have that background as well, but I certainly went on my own experience where I was like, nah, not for me. And had to navigate that. I actually think even to this day, when people find out that I'm a Christian and when they ask me like the follow-up question, like, oh, were you raised that way? I can't, I hate it. I almost don't want to answer it because I feel like there's so many expectations or ideas around that, as if I haven't kind of come up with my own beliefs, or as if I haven't thought about it, or I don't know. I always just try to dodge that because
I wonder why do you think, let's think about why they're asking that question. Is it because I guess it depends on the context, right? Because if you're talking to an agnostic or an atheistic person, they might be having a dig that's just how you've been, you haven't questioned your faith that you were given, sort of thing. But if you're asking I don't know, it's funny, and I don't know if it's just in our faith community or if it's in many Christian denominations, where it's almost testing your pedigree. If another person from that denomination meets you, they often want to make the family connections. Who are you related to? Who were the workers, that they might have known? And then there's this family tree sort of connection going on. And sometimes I wonder if the question's asked in that sort of spirit, what's the story? How did this happen, sort of thing. So but there are connotations or assumptions that are made around that, aren't there?
Yeah, I think I've had people ask it from the atheist point of view, who believe well, there's so many objections, there's so many things you can prove against it, and so they've kind of asked it thinking you obviously haven't thought about this.
Right.
And then I've also had people, I think, who were just curious and are like, oh, how did you come to that position? Or what has that journey been like? But I don't know, there are verses in the Bible that talk about you needing to have an answer for when people ask you things. And I think one of maybe the downsides of being raised in an Adventist or in a Christian background is that we kind of don't really think about things. We just take it in and we memorize it, but we don't actually know the why or the reason behind things. And so
I think that's what people are often assuming or worried about. If you, and it seems to bear out, just anecdotally, people seem to think, oh, well, if you're a second or third generation, there seems to be a waning of passion, or they're looking for a reason. People always look for a story behind something. So if they see young people leaving the church and they've got Christian parents, Christian grandparents, I think there's a natural human tendency to try and figure out, well, what was the reason? Why did this break down somewhere? But I think on the flip side of that, faith can't necessarily be passed on. And I think that's one thing we need to be conscious of as the church. We need to do a good job of explaining to each new generation. We can't just assume that because someone was raised in the church that they have this deep and meaningful journey or relationship with God. If they don't know the why of what they believe and they get challenged at some point, whatever point that might be, then it can cause them to question or for their faith to crumble because they've hit something that there was unexpected and no one's given them an answer. And I think as Christians, that's why it's important for us to be open to questions and open to doubt, because if we're not open to having those conversations with our young people, the danger is that if they hit up against someone who doesn't believe the same that they do, then they could just reject it because it sounds better coming from someone else, because they haven't had that challenging journey of questioning and committing to their own faith. And so that's why it's hard to be black and white and lay down the law and tell people this is what you have to be and this is what you have to do, because certain personalities respond to that, and if they go along with that, that's fine. But other people don't respond to that and they don't form their own basis for faith, and then we can lose many people from the church by just not giving them the space and the time to wrestle with their questions and have conversations about some of those sort of things.
Yeah, I remember when I was in high school, I went from non-Adventist education to just like high school, and so at this stage I was still like identifying as what my family was, but hadn't really like gone through that journey of like figuring it out on my own. And someone asked me something, and then they just asked, their follow-up question was, why do you believe that? Or like, why is that true? And I was just like, oh, I have no idea. And it was the first time someone had actually like pointed out the why thing to me. And so I think from that point, like I had to kind of get in the habit of asking myself, like, well, not asking myself, but asking about everything. Like, why is that true? Or why do I believe that? Or why do we do this? Because prior to that, it was just like, that's just how life was and that's what you did. And that was truth and that was not. And so I think, yeah, like you said, asking why is super important and should be encouraged.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you might have, you mentioned just now leaving and coming back, sort of, I think everyone's got that kind of story, or that kind of, I think everyone, as we've reflected already, has to take ownership of their faith. Let's put it that way. Can you tell us a little bit, you don't have to go into the whole details of everything, but what that journey looked like for you in terms of leaving and coming back? Why did you leave and why did you come back? And is there anything that we can learn for this discussion because you'd left and come back?
Yeah, I think I started leaving and disengaging from the faith in high school. Just because most of my grade didn't associate with any religion. They were just nothing. They were just kids at school. And I think I started at that point to be like, oh, everyone else's lives seem fine without God and without all these rules. And then there was also so many things happening like on the Sabbath that I felt like I was really missing out on. So there was like, dance rehearsals and sports and like people doing fun things. And at that point, the Sabbath just became annoying and restricting. Like it was robbing me from pursuing my joys and from having friendships. And so that part kind of fell away then. And then just over like the next few years, as I left school and kept those friendships, I just didn't think it was like necessary because none of my other friends, like I said, had a faith and they were doing fine and they were having fun. And so that was kind of when I left then. And a few years I was out of the church, maybe like 3 years. And then I went on like an accidental spiritual journey around Asia for a few years. And I was just surrounded by all these different faiths, like all these different religions and all these different beliefs. And I guess I was just a curious kid and was like naturally questioning everything. And like I would often talk to strangers in other countries and just ask them about like what they believed and how they'd got to that point. And so I didn't intend to go on that kind of spiritual journey through Asia. It's a very like cliche movie kind of thing to do, but it happened. And like, I guess I started questioning at that point, like why have my parents, my grandparents followed these ways, and like, is there any truth to that? And like, is there any truth to any of these other religions? And so I just really went on like a journey of asking a lot of questions and found myself back in the place, like with a lot more, I guess, like once I came back to Australia, I started doing like Bible studies, and I think I did one Bible study like 6 times because I just wasn't content with the answer. Like I also didn't want to follow like Adventism just because it was comfortable and just because it sounded right or felt good or, you know, any of that. I wanted to follow it because it was actually true. So I had to go on that long journey.
Yeah, we've got some comments here from Charity. She's just reflecting. It's a third generation born in the church, but left the church a long time. I've way more years out of the church than in the church. That's interesting. And then she was zealous about her heritage faith. Well, I assume it's a female. I shouldn't assume, maybe. At Charity, never fully understood the full concept of personal relationship with God. It wasn't until I took the path of the prodigal son that I understood, and it was then I was in the dark that I realized what the light was and how much I needed him. And I guess that's a nice thing about what I really like that term, a heritage faith. It's like if you have been exposed to God and to Jesus in your early years, there's always the chance that you might come back once you find yourself in difficulty. You know, it may not feel relevant or feel real when you're in it and you're comfortable, but once you've left and you find yourselves in dark and difficult places, sometimes it's that attractive thing. You know, you know where the light is, or the truth, or the, you know, different people use different words for it. It might be where you come back to. Can you tell us in a nutshell, like you said you did one Bible study 6 times, was that a same topic 6 times with different people or different studies, or was that the same person with the same, like, over again, the same study over and over again because you just couldn't get it or didn't?
Yeah, it was the same subject over and over again because I just
Right.
kept coming up with questions, and I was having conversations in between that with people who didn't believe that, and then at the same time I was like going to every different denominational church and kind of seeing how they did things. It was just like a few years of exploration. It's made my faith like so much stronger, and so it's really important. I think we also have a lot to learn from other churches, and so
I think we do. I want to know 2 things, and I might ask them one at a time, just not to confuse you. I want to know what you learned from that experience, like of journeying and exploring and trying different things. What really stood out to you? And it might be related, but what was the thing, or it was probably a number of factors, but what was it that made you eventually decide, like, this is it, like I'm committing back to this path, like I'm gonna do that? Was it from things you saw outside and learnt from, or were they separate? Like, because you just said, you know, we can learn a lot from other churches. I'd be interested to know what we can learn and what you learnt, but and from your journey, you know. But what's the one thing that brought you back or really, you know, locked you in?
I think first of all it was gaining a clearer picture on the actual character of God, like, because I think in the Adventist church we learn a lot about like the 28 fundamentals, and we learn a lot about the doctrines, but not everyone links that up with what that means about, or what that says about the character of God. It just seemed like a lot of like big words and a lot of like trouble. I think for some people it's kind of like, okay, like who cares? What does that mean? How is that relevant to my life? And so I guess I was just blessed to have people who were able to show me that side of God. And so that was a big thing, because I suppose in a lot of other religions especially, God wasn't always like such a loving God as he's depicted in Christianity. So that then was a turn off for me choosing other religions, where maybe he's not depicted as loving, or he's not really someone I would want to follow, or not really someone I would want to be like. And so that was a massive thing. And then there was also the aspect of like I could see the benefit of being in a community and being part of a faith group, in terms of like my own maturity and personal growth. And yeah, so that was also a massive thing. I could just like see, not only from Adventists but from like other Christian denominations, the importance of community and the power of community.
Yep.
Yeah, so I would say that's probably was the big turning point for me.
I think that's really important. We often don't communicate the character of God well. And I think Adventism, just to speak from our own faith perspective, I think we have a lot of really beautiful things to say about God's character. You know, the free will that we believe in. Not all Christians believe in that same sense of free will, and even the investigative judgment, that sort of, some of those doctrines explain and show the character of God as loving and patient and kind, when other people say God is love, but some of the doctrines that they hold to demonstrate something different. I think people get confused. There's a disconnect. And I'm not saying that Adventist doctrine is necessarily perfect, or that we always explain it or put it across right, because, you know, I'm sure you and I have both met Adventists who don't show the character of God or demonstrate the character of God as well as they could. We don't, as individuals, you know. Those of you watching this, you know, Zanita and I are not perfect. Surprise, surprise. We don't always demonstrate the character of God perfectly. So, you know, we're all fallen and stuff. But, you know, I think we have some things in our faith tradition that they give us that opportunity to explore and express the character of God in a really balanced and a really beautiful way. Whether we're not always bringing that out well, I don't know. We don't always pass maybe that on. We get caught up in the do's and don'ts that you mentioned, or the explicit doctrines, without the way of seeing how they all connect together to form the whole mosaic, you know, the whole picture of what God's character looks like. I guess I had quite a different journey to you in some ways.
Tell me about what your journey has been like.
Yeah. I do know at one point in my life, I really, you know, you hear these inspirational testimonies, you know, people did this and that, and they wandered away from God, and they got into rebellion and difficult circumstances and darkness. And they sort of say that, and you can feel, if you've grown up in the church, you can feel like, where's my experience? You know, what's my testimony? What's God doing for me? You know, I haven't maybe got that experience. And so for a number of years I felt like that. And then I realized, like, just with the trials of life, like the burdens that we all carry, you know, you can work for God and you can be in the church your whole life, but still face significant challenges that God can help you through. Like, he's always offering that assistance. And I guess for me, I went to an Adventist school, high school, I did do a year at State University, but then I went to Avondale to finish my degree. So I did a couple of years at Avondale, and so again, I was in a sort of Adventist bubble, if you will. And then I was working for Record, so I was working for the church straight out of college. However, even though I was working for the church, and I emphasize this to people because, you know, I was working for the church, but I felt quite disconnected at some points in that journey from God. As in, I had moved away from home where I was really involved in my local church growing up, and I had trouble finding another church home to be involved in. And I think being at church, having a community of believers, keeps you sort of on the straight and narrow. If you're not growing and developing in your faith, I think you're going backwards in your faith sometimes. You can't sort of stay still. You can't just be a stagnant Christian. You're either growing or you're stagnating. You're you know, corrupting, rotting. And I went through a season probably of quite a while where because I wasn't active in church, because I was just attending for the sermon or just going and being there, I was there in the flesh. My heart was still with God. I never sort of deconstructed my faith and walked away entirely. but I did struggle to connect, and I struggled to connect with others, and I struggled to connect with God, and through, I guess, meeting a new local church when I moved to Sydney, getting some, I guess, mentors or some discipleship training, some people that got me active again, actually sharing with others my faith. That's what revitalizes your faith. Often I think as Christians, if we're not sharing our faith, we actually can stagnate and lose our faith journey. And so for me, and then there's been times since, you could call them seasons of discontent or doubt or struggle. I've seen God take me through some of those things. So about this topic, I'm very passionate. Yes, I was born in a loving family. I had not too many issues growing up. I was happy with the church. I was loving being part of the church. I've never decided to reject God or walk away completely, but I have had to make those choices myself. I have had the difficult conversations about what do I really believe about this stuff? Had that challenged and had to own it as well. To make a decision to leave your family, move interstate, work for the church, you have to be pretty sure that you're doing the right thing, or that you're doing it for the right reasons as well. So for me, I think, I can definitely see that while people take different paths, each and every one of us actually has to make a choice. Are we going to stick with this or maybe not? Are we going to continue, and how can we continue in a healthy way, not just echoing and repeating the patterns of our forefathers, like doing the rituals of faith, but actually having a personal relationship and actually growing in that relationship. I do believe that we have to grow as Christians. We can't just be saved and then just sit where we are, and just that's it, we're done.
Yeah, I guess one question I have is, well, I have a few, but you said that you had to make your faith your own. What did that look like? How did your faith become more unique than what had kind of been handed to you? Did you have different rituals, or did you have different ways of practicing your faith, or what do you mean when you say make it your own?
That's a really good question. Well, I think first of all, you can't just coast on the coattails of those that have gone before you. So I do believe each and every one of us has to make a decision, right? So to be baptized, for example, I put off baptism for quite a long time. I was 19 when I got baptized. A lot of kids in church get baptized a lot younger. I was putting it off because I wanted to make sure and that. But you have to, there's that point of decision. You have to decide, am I going to stay or am I going to go? A lot of young people get their license. They can not, their parents may not force them to come to church anymore. They're not just going because of their parents. They decide to continue to go. And I think we all have to decide in that way. I guess with making my faith my own, you do have to navigate the questions that you have. My family were incredibly loving. They showed me the loving character of God, which I to this day appreciate. But they're probably slightly more conservative than I would be finding myself now in terms of my practice and my rituals and the things that you asked about. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I have a lot of respect for people because that's where I feel like I've come from. But at the same time, when tricky situations come up, when questions over doctrine or how to practice the Sabbath or how to treat certain groups of people, I've had to study and understand for myself, and I've had to find a faith that if we sat down with my parents and I talked to them about, I don't know an example off the top of my head, but I imagine that we would have slightly differing views on certain points of practice or doctrine or things. When I say slightly different, I think we would mainly have a lot in common, most things in common, but there would probably be things that we didn't agree with generationally. And looking at my grandparents and what they, again, it would be very different to even my parents and their practice and understanding, and then my practice and understanding. And so part of that is cultural change, part of that is generational change, and the emphasis that each generation has on the importance of their faith and whatever. And we can get stuck in the point, well, that generation was right and everyone else is failing, or everyone else is moving away from the core of the faith. But I am part of a denomination that believes in present truth, and our fundamentals, the preamble to our fundamentals talks about the Spirit revealing himself for the times and the places and, that sort of thing. So for me, I think that's what I mean when I say things like whatever I said, choosing my own faith, like finding it for myself, making that decision. Because if I sat down with my most of my grandparents have passed away now, but if I sat down with my grandparents, if I sat down with my parents, it would be probable that we differ in certain points, but we have the same faith. We have the same motivation behind why we have the faith. But I've had to navigate that because it's black and white when you're a kid. There's this funny story I tell my mum. So people that I meet, I was at a funeral on Monday, and I was like, oh no, I'm vegetarian. They're like, oh, okay, how long have you been vegetarian? My whole life. They're like, what? Like it's like some lifestyle choice that I've made in the last few years. No, I've actually born and raised. And I say, well, I don't miss it. I don't want to experience it because then it will be tricky. But I don't know what I don't know. So I'm not missing out on anything. I'm happy. I'm content as a vegetarian. So just thinking about that, when I was a kid, so my mum used to come back on furloughs and stuff, and obviously they went vegetarian when they became Adventists, but they had family members who would feed them who weren't vegetarian, and she'd have the taste of meat. Maybe they ate fish in the islands when they grew up, and so I saw one time there was like a can of tuna in our shopping trolley. And I was horrified. I thought, what is happening? How did this? I said, Mum, how did this get in here? Right? Oh, we must have brushed, it must have fallen in off the shelf. Like, it's okay. She put it back, Then at another point, I was foraging through the cupboard, the kitchen cupboard, trying to find something to eat, something to snack on. I found a couple of cans of tuna. Mum, what? I was horrified. She said, I was a bit older probably by then, and she's like, look, sometimes I get a real craving like for tuna. I don't eat it. I choose to be vegetarian, but every now and then I have a little bit, like, it's fine, like whatever. And she may not have done that for 20 years now. Like it wasn't often, but I just happened to find it. And as a child, black and white, like what I'd been taught, vegetarian, like I was horrified. It just, my little tiny brain could not compute that my mother was eating meat, Now, my wife eats meat. I'm married to a woman who eats chicken, and fish sometimes. So it's I can compute that now. But often as kids, we can't. Everything's very black and white, idealistic. And when something comes along to shake the foundations, like that's not actually true, it's not universally true, it's not really how the world works, that can really shake our faith if our faith has very shallow foundations and we haven't made choices for ourselves, like to understand going back to what you said, why we believe what we believe. We have to know the why. And so I think for me, that's just an example of how I guess my faith and my beliefs have maybe changed over my life as I got older and less black and white as a child, but also just as I read more widely and I got more life experience. Your faith has to somehow marry up to your life experience, What does my faith say about this situation? How do I navigate challenges that come up in life using my faith as a handbook or a guidebook, using it as my compass? Well, I can't do that if my faith doesn't speak to that scenario. So I have to make it my own, I guess, in that sense, by making that choice to understand what my faith says about the world around me. And as our situations change, our faith changes. Now, people listening, I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Like, I do think there's absolute moral truth that God exists and He's set out certain principles and that stuff. But the older I get and experience more different cultures and the way they do things, people keep the Sabbath on the other side of the world differently to how we might keep the Sabbath. We might be horrified at one thing they do, and yet they might be horrified at something we do, and yet something else they do is just commonplace for them that we are uncomfortable with. So who's right and wrong? Well, unless we have, God revealing it to us directly, it's very hard to know. So yeah, we have to use our faith to understand the world around us. And I think that's one problem that we have with passing faith on to generations. We don't all take ownership and intentionally bring it on board.
Yeah, I think our experience or our relationship with God is going to look unique to all of us anyway, and so our faiths are going to look different, and our journeys are going to look different as well. I think one thing also, kind of touching on what you were saying about, like, we have to come to a point where we have to make it our own. One thing I've learned over the last few years that is like an ongoing kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a practice, so we'll just call it a practice. It's like an ongoing practice that I've been doing is questioning my like shoulds. So when I find myself saying like, I should go to church, or I should pay tithe, or I should read my Bible, or I should not buy this can of tuna, or whatever it is. Because when we say we should do something, it's kind of coming from a resistant place. Like we're not really doing it. Like the word should doesn't have connotations to it. It kind of has a negative side to it. And so I think when we are doing things out of that place of I should do this, we're doing it out of obligation or expectation or habit, and that's why we have this resistance, because we haven't really taken ownership of that and made it our own. And so it doesn't mean that those things are bad. Like, it doesn't mean when I think like I should go to church, it doesn't mean I should just not go to church because that's a should. It just means that I should like question like, well, like, why should I go to church? Like, is that something I actually want to do? Is that something I actually believe in? Is there benefits to that? And kind of coming up with that for myself, or making that my own thing, and then like changing the language around it. So instead of saying I should go to church, being like, I'm going to go to church to connect with people, or to what the reasons are. And so that's like something that I'm constantly kind of doing with my faith.
I think it's important to have as well to maybe turn those shoulds. What I'm hearing you say, or how I'm interpreting it for myself, is we need to be able to change those shoulds in some contexts to want. I want to go to church.
Yeah,
is sort of what you're saying, because it's like should is out of a sense of guilt or obligation, and it may not actually be God that's planting that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That motivation, and yet if we want to do it, it means that we've processed it, we've made a decision that it's something that's important to us, and we've taken ownership, and we're now living that way. And I think that's a helpful thing for us all to do with our faith.
Yeah. I think another thing that Olivia mentioned in her piece was that she was comparing her faith to the people of the Old Testament, in terms of like, why was God doing such incredible things in their lives and she wasn't really seeing the same in her life. And she said that part of her, I suppose, having a more personal experience was things like community, which is something that you also touched on. Like, you said that you were struggling with your faith because you didn't really have a church that you belonged to. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, what is the link between, because I don't know, like, we can have like an awesome community, but how is that impacting our relationship with God?
Great question. I think, firstly, to Olivia's point, I think the way I look at it is think about all the millions and now billions of people that have lived, and there's only a certain number of stories. There are heaps of stories in the Bible, but there's only a couple of 100, maybe even 1,000 characters compared to the billions of people. The reason they're in the Bible is because it was miraculous. It was special. Even all the patriarchs and all the list of genealogies, only a few people were actually told their stories in depth because it was miraculous what happened to them. It was a real close encounter with God. I think God wants to work with each and every one of us, but it doesn't mean that we're going to have that road to Damascus experience that just turns us around and like makes us like struck by lightning, like, oh, I need to do this. Where the community comes in, I think it's just important. I think church attendance and church community, it keeps us serving. I think one part is to be involved, and when your faith, I think we can get spiritually unfit or spiritually obese if we're just getting information. If our faith is informational, we're just feeding our brains with faith, right? And so I could attend sermons in that time in my life. I was working for the church, writing and thinking about faith things. I loved God. I had a faith as such journey that I was constantly thinking about and learning about, but I wasn't practicing it. I wasn't exercising. I wasn't doing the spiritual disciplines. Church is a place where you can exercise your faith in a good community. Everyone will have an opportunity to be involved. And to me, I see that it's maybe a flawed metaphor, but it's like exercising. It's the spiritual disciplines are exercising your faith. So you're passing it on. You have the opportunity to share. The church that I did get passionate about becoming part of again was a missional minded church. It was a church that was trying to be a church plant, trying to be an outreach. And so we had some evangelistic camps. We had opportunities to share devotions and share messages with people and share your faith. And when you're, I think, looking at your faith journey to share with someone else, when you're telling your testimony or doing that, it keeps you active and motivated. It keeps you connected to God. You're relying on God in that way. And so I think to serve, to share, and to just, we talked a few weeks ago, I think, about worship languages, worship styles. And I think for me, one of them is connection, talking about God with others and sharing God with others. That's one of my worship languages where I feel closely connected to God, because I'm expressing and trying to understand how other people are expressing God so that I can, think through and come to a conclusion myself. So having that opportunity, which is what church community brings, I think that's why it's really important to have that connection to community. It gives us a reason to keep showing up. It gives us, there's verses in the Bible, do not cease meeting together, basically don't stop. Just because you can have a personal faith and you can watch church on the internet and you can get fed, read theology books all the time, that's not going to work for everyone. They need people to connect and to share. It's like a cell wall. There's osmosis happening. We're going faith in, faith out in a community like that. I think that's, for me, that's one way that's important.
Yeah, we have a comment from the author herself. She said, often people are afraid to share their testimony because they are afraid they haven't had many God moments. But if we talk weekly about how God has been working in our lives, can open the door to seeing God more in our lives too, and helps us more confident to share God with others. Yeah, so good.
I'm a big believer in that. I do testimony workshops where I teach people how important stories are and how they should be telling their testimonies. And one of the points that I make is your testimony from 30 years ago, how you gave up drinking and got baptized and became perfect. It can be very discouraging for people because it's such a big, glorious journey that they go, well, I'm so far from reaching that point. I just don't know how that can happen. And it also can become stale. It's like, that's my story and everybody knows that's your story, but there's no growth, and we can become trapped in that space. We have this big experience, but if we stop there, we're not growing, we're not developing, we're not encountering God, and we will stagnate, we will grow stale. And so I think we do need weekly and daily encounters with God. We talk about daily devotions and morning watch, and we should connect with God every day. Some of us are not doing it that easily and that regularly. But I think that's okay if we are experiencing God and we're looking for how he's working in our lives, because I don't think the Holy Spirit ever leaves us. I don't think Jesus ever says, you know what, I'm going on long service leave. You can have a break from me for a few months. We might feel far from God in times of our lives, but it's not because he's quiet or he's absent. It's just because maybe we're not seeing what he's been doing. Or maybe we're waiting, he's patiently waiting to prepare us for something else. The waiting time is preparing us for something else. And I think we have to have more recent, updated testimonies. I think that's a really important part of our journey. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves, before we know it, we'll find ourselves like we've gone 5 steps forward, but 20 steps back, because we don't even realize that we've slid back from where we were.
Yeah. The day-to-day gritty stories is what we need more of. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. I suppose, to land the plane, you've kind of already spoken about some practical things, but are there any other practical things you would suggest people, in maybe those who are generational Christians, how can they make their faith their own?
2 things, and I'll be interested to see if you've got any, or any of our viewers as well. We have to be intentional for our children. We can get very busy in life, and we not all of us may have children yet, but I have a daughter now and I have a son on the way, and I'm like, am I putting in good worship at home practices? Are they going to get the same opportunity to know all their Bible stories as I did? My mum used to read the Bible stories to us, and I thought it was nothing, but I now know my Bible quite well, and I can pick out examples or applications for my own life because I know all these stories because she told them to us. And so one thing is really being intentional for, if we want our kids to stay in the church, we have to find ways to engage them with faith. We can't be afraid of them asking questions. And if we don't know the answer, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Let's find out together, and go on a journey with your children to actually learn some of those things. Because, faith can't just be passed on without intentionality. I think the other thing that I'm thankful for, my personality, I sometimes struggle with eating when I'm stressed. Okay, I eat too much. Well, if I wonder if I wasn't an Adventist, being an Australian, I would definitely have been exposed to alcohol. Now, I've never tried an alcoholic drink. I've avoided it my whole life. If I was to have access to alcohol, I wonder if I would have been an alcoholic with an addictive tendency. I wonder some of the other vices that I've avoided because I'm an Adventist, if some of those things would have been problematic for me. And so I'm thankful. I think one thing we need to do is not to complain like, oh, I haven't had a chance to have a testimony. I haven't had a chance to, experience the world. I've just been in this bubble my whole life. Let's give thanks for the opportunities that we've had because we are Adventists. We have good health, longevity, good education, and emphasis on education. We have a lot of advantages. Adventists are upwardly mobile people in many senses. We seem to do quite well in society. So, we might start off working class or immigrants, but often we emphasize education, we emphasize these things, and we see our families being successful. So we have to give thanks for some of the generational blessings that we've got. In Deuteronomy, in a number of places, it says, remember the things that the Lord has done for you. It says, for those that are, unrighteous, that walk away, that do bad things, they're going to be cursed for 3 or 4 generations. But those that love the Lord will be blessed for 1,000 generations. And I look at my family legacy of Adventism and Christianity, and I've got stories about the Lutherans that first came to Australia for religious reasons because they're in my family too. And I see God, if I look with God's lenses on, I see God blessing the generations. He does be faithful to those who are faithful to him. And so we have to be intentional with our children, and we have to count the blessings that we do have to have been brought up as Adventist Christians. I think we need to remember that. Do you have one for us, Anita? Do you have something?
I feel like I have multiple. I think the ones we've already touched on is like definitely becoming okay with asking the big questions, like ask why about everything, and also like question your shoulds. But I think also like in terms of having our own relationship with God, or like fostering our own personal relationship with God, is like how can I word this? Like your faith isn't going to look like everyone else's, maybe in your family or in your church. And so like personalize that relationship with God, like you personalize your relationship with your different friends. And so we haven't really touched on this. We could touch on this in a future episode, I suppose. But there's things like when we have a relationship, say with a partner or a friend, we have like love languages. And so we can also have like love languages with God. Like we will, some of us will connect with him more in like worship music. Some of us will connect more in nature. And so I think like just explore how you connect with God better and make that relationship your own. And that can be like a really exciting and a really beautiful journey, I think.
I like it.
And yeah, I think that's all I'd really say on that.
Beautiful. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Olivia, for writing this thought-provoking piece. It's great to have young writers in Record, and we're very happy to explore topics like this. If you pick up, it's dated for this coming Sabbath, October the 15th. So if you're in church and you can pick up a copy of Record, you can read Olivia's piece there. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next week. It's Adventist Heritage Week coming up. The October 22nd is a big date for Adventists, so we're going to talk to the Heritage Director next week, and that'll be a really good conversation. So don't miss out. We'll see you then, Zanita, and everyone else.
Sweet.
Bye.